My name is Claire Bennett, and I was 13 years old the night my parents put my suitcase on the porch and locked the door behind me. I want you to sit with that for a second. Not grounded. Not sent to my room. Locked out. On a porch. In October. In Ohio, where the temperature drops to 40 degrees the second the sun goes down. I remember the exact sound the deadbolt made. A heavy, final click. Like a period at the end of a sentence my parents had been writing about me my whole life, a sentence that ended with the word unwanted. To understand how a 13-year-old ends up on a porch with a suitcase, you have to understand my family. On the surface, we looked perfect. My father, Richard Bennett, owned a chain of hardware stores across 3 counties. My mother, Diane, sat on the board of the country club and hosted a book club that never actually discussed books. We lived in a 5-bedroom colonial with a circular driveway. From the outside, we were the family everyone envied. But I had an older brother, Grant, for years older than me, and Grant was the son our entire household orbited. Grant was going to take over the business. Grant was going to marry well. Grant could do no wrong, and when Grant did do wrong, I was usually the one who took the blame, because in my parents' eyes, I was the accident. The unplanned second child who arrived when my mother was already exhausted from raising a golden boy. The night it happened, Grant, 17 at the time, had taken my father's car without permission and put a dent in the garage door backing out too fast. When my parents came home and saw the damage, Grant told them I did it. That I'd begged to sit in the driver's seat and pretend to drive, and that I'd knocked it into gear. I was 13. I didn't even have a permit. It made no logical sense. But my father didn't ask for logic. He asked Grant to confirm the story, and Grant, with tears actually welling in his eyes, a performance worthy of an Oscar, nodded and said, "I tried to stop her, Dad." That was it. That was the whole trial. No evidence. No mercy. Just my father's belief that his son could never lie to him, and his conviction that I was, as he put it that night, a disruptive presence in this family that we didn't ask for. My mother didn't say a single word in my defense. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed while my father packed a suitcase with some of my clothes, walked me to the porch, and told me a car would come get me in the morning. It didn't. I sat on that porch until nearly midnight, until a neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, saw me shivering under the porch light and brought me inside. Mrs. Alvarez called Child Protective Services herself. My parents, faced with a possible investigation, spun the story into something more palatable for the outside world. Claire is going through a very difficult phase, and we've decided, painful as it is, that professional intervention is what's best for her. Translation: they shipped me off. First to a distant cousin in Michigan who didn't want me either, and eventually, at 15, into the foster system, because even that cousin gave up. I want to be clear about something, because this story isn't really about self-pity. It's about what happens next. Because here's the thing about being thrown away by the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally: it either breaks you completely, or it forges something in you that can never be broken again. For me, it was the second one. I won't drag you through every hard year, because there were a lot of them. Group homes. A foster family in Toledo who were kind but overwhelmed with 5 other kids. A guidance counselor named Mr. Osei, who was the first adult in years to ask me what I wanted, rather than what I'd done wrong. He was the one who told me about a scholarship program for foster youth headed to college, and he was the one who sat with me at 2 a.m., helping me write an essay about resilience that I didn't even believe I had yet. I got into Ohio State on that scholarship. I studied business, not because I dreamed of hardware stores, ironically, but because I wanted to understand the systems that had controlled my entire childhood. I wanted to understand money, contracts, leverage. I wanted to understand the language my father spoke fluently and had used against me my whole life. After graduation, I didn't go home. There was no home to go to. My parents hadn't attended my high school graduation, hadn't called, hadn't sent so much as a birthday card in 5 years. As far as they were concerned, I had ceased to exist the moment that deadbolt clicked. So I built a life without them. I started in commercial real estate, working brutal hours for a firm in Columbus, sleeping in my car more nights than I want to admit during the early years. But I was good at it, better than good. I had a talent for seeing value where other people saw risk, maybe because I'd learned as a kid to survive in conditions where nobody else could. By 24, I'd started my own firm. By 28, Bennett Meridian Properties. No, I didn't name it after my father. That's just an odd coincidence of surnames. My mother's maiden name was actually Meridian, and I chose it deliberately, a small private joke only I understood. Had a portfolio worth more than my father's entire hardware store empire. I never once reached out to my parents to tell them any of this. Not out of some noble restraint. I genuinely didn't think about them most days. You'd be amazed how much room in your head opens up once you stop trying to earn love from people who decided long ago you didn't deserve it. But they were watching. Small towns talk and word travels, especially when the daughter you disowned starts showing up in regional business journals. And Grant, Golden Boy Grant, was not doing well. The hardware store chain, once thriving, had been slowly gutted by his mismanagement. He'd taken over as CEO in his late 20s, and over the following decade, he ran it the way spoiled kings run kingdoms. They were handed rather than built, badly. Layoffs. Store closures. Rumors of gambling debts. My father, in his 70s now, had stepped back from daily operations, trusting Grant completely, still convinced his son could do no wrong. I found all this out later. At the time, I didn't know any of it. I was 3 states away, building something real, while behind me, the family that discarded me was quietly falling apart. 15 years to the month after that porch, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. Ohio area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. I get a lot of cold calls from brokers, but something made me pick up. It was a lawyer named Harold Weiss. He introduced himself as the estate attorney for Richard Bennett. My father was dead. He'd had a massive stroke 3 weeks earlier and passed within days. I felt strange hearing it, not devastated, not relieved, just a kind of hollow, clinical numbness, the way you might feel hearing about the death of a stranger you'd read about once in a news article. 15 years of silence does that. Grief needs a relationship to attach itself to, and we hadn't had one in over a decade. What Harold said next is what actually made me sit down. MS. Bennett, your father updated his will 8 months before he passed. You're named in it. We need you present for the reading. I told him there had to be some mistake. My father hadn't spoken to me since I was 13. Harold, a careful, measured man, simply said, I can't discuss the contents ahead of the reading, but I'd strongly encourage you to attend in person. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about that. Part of me wanted to tell Harold Weiss to mail me whatever paperwork was necessary and leave it at that. But another part of me, the 13-year-old, still living somewhere inside the woman I'd become, needed to walk back into that world one more time. Needed to see, with my own eyes, whatever this was. So I flew back to Ohio. The reading took place in Harold Weiss's office, a wood-paneled room that smelled like old paper and expensive cologne. My mother was there, 71 now, thinner than I remembered, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Grant sat beside her, 41 years old, wearing a suit that looked like it had been expensive 5 years ago and was now straining at the shoulders. His wife, Patricia, sat stiffly beside him, and I noticed she wouldn't quite meet my mother's eyes. Nobody hugged me. Nobody said they'd missed me. My mother looked at me for exactly 3 seconds when I walked in, said, Claire, in the tone you'd use to acknowledge a coworker you didn't particularly like, and looked away. Harold began reading. The house, the same colonial with the circular driveway, was left to my mother, along with the contents of a modest retirement account. That was expected. Then Harold moved to the business. To my son, Grant Richard Bennett, he read, I leave the remaining company vehicles and equipment, along with my personal collection of tools. The room went very quiet. Grant's face shifted from confused to pale. That's it, Grant said. What about the stores? What about the company? Harold continued, unbothered. The controlling interest in Bennett Hardware Group, including all real property, inventory, and remaining capital, is left in its entirety to my daughter, Claire Diane Bennett. I want you to understand, I did not see this coming. I had assumed, at most, my father had left me some small token gesture, a guilty conscience payout, maybe a symbolic dollar. Instead, I had just inherited a business worth, even in its damaged state, several $1,000,000. A business run by the brother who had lied his way into ruining my childhood, and who had also apparently spent the last decade running that same business into the ground. My mother stood up so fast her chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "This is insane," she said. "This is not what Richard wanted. There has to be another version. Harold, there must be an earlier will, the real one." Harold, calm as ever, slid a document across the table. "This is the most recent will, executed and notarized 8 months ago. Mr. Bennett was fully lucid at the time, and there were 2 independent witnesses present. I can assure you, Diane, this is legally sound." That's when my mother did something I genuinely never expected from the composed, country club woman who'd stood in a doorway 15 years earlier and said nothing while I was thrown out into the cold. She lunged across the table. Not violently at me, at the documents. She grabbed for the will itself, as if she could physically tear the words off the page and undo them, screaming that this couldn't be legal, that Richard would never do this to Grant, that I didn't deserve any of it, that I had abandoned this family. I let that last part sit in the air for a moment before I spoke. 15 years of silence had taught me the value of choosing words carefully. "I abandoned this family?" I said. "You put my suitcase on the porch. I was 13. My mother froze mid-reach, Harold's assistant gently guiding her hand back from the papers. And for the first time in 15 years, I watched something crack in my mother's face, not remorse, not yet. Something closer to the horror of realizing the story she'd told herself all these years, the one where she was blameless, where I was simply a difficult child who'd chosen to leave, had just been read back to her in a lawyer's office in front of witnesses. Harold asked to speak with me privately after the reading. He told me something my father had said to him during the will's drafting that I didn't expect to hear. Apparently, about a year before his death, my father had seen an article about Bennett Meridian Properties in a Cleveland business journal. He hadn't known it was me at first. Meridian, after all, was my mother's maiden name, not our shared surname. But there was a photo. And he recognized his own daughter's face, 13 years grown, standing in front of a building she owned. According to Harold, my father sat with that article for weeks. He began quietly looking into the hardware store's finances Grant had kept carefully massaged and vague for years, and discovered the truth: mounting debt, missed vendor payments, 2 lawsuits from former employees, and a 6-figure gambling debt Grant had paid off using company funds without board approval, because there was no Real board, just my father's rubber stamp. My father, Harold said, never once called me to apologize. He was too proud, too stubborn, too much the same man who'd locked a 13-year-old out on a porch without asking a single question. But somewhere in that pride was also a business instinct he'd spent his whole life honing, and that instinct told him something simple and brutal. The daughter he threw away had built something real, and the son he'd protected at any cost had nearly destroyed everything. The will wasn't an apology. Harold was very clear about that, and so am I. I don't romanticize it into some deathbed redemption arc, because my father died without ever once saying my name to my face with anything resembling warmth. But it was, in its own cold, transactional way, an acknowledgement. The only language my father had ever really spoken was the language of competence and results. And in the end, even a man who disowned his daughter for a lie couldn't argue with the numbers. I could have walked away. Honestly, for about a week, I considered it, signing the business over to Grant just to be done with all of them, to close that chapter permanently and never think about Ohio again. But then I thought about the employees. Men and women who'd worked at those stores for 20, 30 years, whose pensions and jobs were on the line because of Grant's mismanagement. I thought about the 13-year-old on that porch and what she would have wanted someone to do with the power she never had. So I took the company. I didn't do it with cruelty, though I understand if part of you wanted me to. I brought in an outside CFO to audit everything properly. I restructured the debt. I kept every single employee who wanted to stay. And Grant, I offered a job. Not as CEO. As a regional store manager, the same entry-level operations role any new hire would start in, with the explicit condition that if he wanted a future with the company, he'd need to actually learn how to run it from the ground up. The way I'd had to learn everything in my life from the ground up. He didn't take it. His pride, it turns out, is a genetic trait. He and Patricia moved to Columbus a few months later. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he's selling insurance now. My mother still lives in the house. I don't call her, and she doesn't call me. There was no tearful reconciliation scene, no movie ending where she showed up at my office with flowers and an apology 15 years in the making. Real life, in my experience, rarely hands you that kind of closure. What I got instead was something quieter and, honestly, more valuable. I got to watch the woman who chose silence over her own child stand in a room and be forced to reckon, publicly, with exactly what that silence had cost her. That was never really about revenge for me, even though I know that's the word that draws people to a story like this. Revenge implies I built my life around hurting them back. I didn't. I built my life around surviving, and then thriving, entirely without them, and it turned out that the natural consequence of that was watching the family that discarded me collapse under the weight of the golden child they refused to hold accountable. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not fighting harder back then, writing more letters, trying harder to win my parents back once I was an adult with means. I don't. Some doors, once they're locked, you're better off building your own house entirely. If I could go back and speak to that girl shivering on the porch in October, waiting for a car that was never actually coming, I wouldn't tell her that everything works out, because that's a lie you tell children in movies. I'd tell her something more honest, that the people who are supposed to choose you sometimes won't, and that it will feel, for a long time, like the most important verdict ever passed on your worth. But it isn't. It's just one flawed, frightened, prideful family's verdict. And you get to spend the rest of your life proving there's a much bigger court than that. 15 years after they locked that door, I didn't need my mother's love, or my father's approval, or my brother's inheritance to know who I was. I already knew. The will reading didn't give me anything I didn't already have. It just made everyone else finally see it too.